Welcome to Buckets, brought to you by BetMGM, the king of sportsbooks. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network. I'm joined by the future Jays, Joe Dellera and Jim Turvey. You're getting a lot of Joe this month. You're getting a lot of Dellera this month. Not only is he helping me out today with what's going to be a broad conversation about betting NBA futures from a process standpoint, but you'll also be able to catch Joe next week with Brian Fonseca for 2 episodes breaking down the Summer Games basketball tournament. You'll be able to catch all of that, his thoughts on Team USA, prop angles, whoever else they're betting. I'm probably going to bet Germany. That's probably where I'm going to end up on that. And that starts and completes my contribution to international basketball coverage for the Action Network this summer. But you can catch Joe next week alongside Brian Fonseca. They'll be back as well. By the way, Joe, I haven't told you this. You'll be back for another episode for the knockout stage gold medal round as well. So lots of stuff coming out from Joe. You can catch Jim Turvey on the WNBA Buckets podcast, which you should obviously go download right now and check out. That one's going to have a women's episode for the Summer Games as well as the WNBA begins to head on a break. But look, never been a better time for you to get in because obviously women's basketball is blowing up it's been gradually building. Like I've been betting and covering WNBA for the last couple of seasons, but it's hitting a whole new level. I still think that those lines are still pretty malleable, and our guys are having a lot of success betting it nightly. You can check that out on the WNBA Buckets podcast with Maria Marino, Jim Turvey, and their crew. So today, no best bets. You're not getting any sort of like bet this immediately, which we try and do pretty regularly, and not just because Matt Mitchell will always threaten to poke me with a hot stick if I don't provide them. But look, it's the off season, and we did want to have kind of this conversation because Jim Turvey had a comment in the Action Network Slack a couple of weeks ago, and it was kind of talking about like what we look at when we're looking at the title market right after the finals ended and what we were kind of seeing and like the early markets that we were starting to see on some of these odds. And it brings up, I think, a couple of interesting questions I want to get to with the guys and to kind of break down what these thoughts are. Jim, can you kind of give me like a 500,000 foot view on what do you think the biggest challenge is with betting NBA futures, particularly in the off season prior to a full season?
Yeah, and I'll even shrink it down a little bit more to say I think this really is most relevant with title and conference winner futures, which I think are probably the market that collects the most money and probably the market that listeners are the most attuned to, and probably the market that, everyone is the most aware of. So I think it is relevant, even though it is, a smaller collection of markets. There's still other stuff to do out there. But I think with the title and conference winners specifically, I feel like I was having like a midlife crisis in the Slack where like there are a few things in the world I love betting more than futures as a whole. Any sport, any time of year, I'm just always thinking with a futures hat on. But after watching the NBA finals, it kind of clicked with me. I think it actually helped us out a lot. I loved doing these playoff previews because they were so matchup dependent, but it kind of made me realize that the league as is right now is about as matchup dependent as I've ever seen it. And if you're locking up money for, right after the finals, almost a full year, or even later in the summer after free agency, we're talking about, almost 11 months of locking up your money now, and even 8 months until you even know a potential first round matchup. I mean, the Western Conference, you could lock up your money, the seeding could fall out, and you could have a brutal cut of the bracket, and suddenly you just it was a good bet, but suddenly you're looking at 3 straight brutal matchups that you have to work your way through just to get to the finals. So I think there are ways to go about it. I think we'll probably, we'll get into it here throughout the podcast, but it just kind of registered with me of like, man, it does feel like more than, at least within the last, decade, maybe even going back further, even more relevant, that this is the most matchup dependent the league has been in terms of betting those futures at the title and conference level.
I think it's a challenge because you're right that it's so matchup based, especially now in kind of what's considered to be an age of parity. And like, there's going to be understandable challenges of that from folks that are like, well, hang on. So the Celtics won 64 games and were the number 1 seed and they lost like 3 times and it's about matchups. And it's like, well, okay, yes and no, where look, I do think this is kind of the thing is the Celtics never faced that matchup that could catch them. They never, and this is what everyone criticized about them was, eventually, and even our crew got kind of caught up in some team's going to get them. Like some team eventually is going to get this team. And on buckets, if you followed us during the playoffs, you saw a hard pivot from me, which was I waited and I waited and I waited. And then we had look ahead lines for the finals of the Boston Celtics minus 200. And I hammered the shit out of it. And the reason was because I was like, no, like they're not going to get a match. Like they got the Pacers. The Knicks fell apart from an injury standpoint. So they're getting the Pacers. And I think the Mavericks are going to beat the Wolves. And at that point, I was like, there's nothing that's going to stop them. Had I been wrong and the Wolves made the finals, I probably would have bet on the Wolves in that series. Yeah. And I would have had a nice minus 200 to then bet the other way against because the Wolves would have been dogs. Brandon Anderson had a whole speech about this on the Catch That podcast, which you can catch with Joe, where he's kind of like railing against the idea of hedging. And we'll get into that conversation a little bit more. You can absolutely do a thing where you're basically betting all these angles and you're taking it too far when you're trying to put these future bets in. And what's tough, I think, in the preseason is you want to be like, well, if you're going to bet in the preseason, bet the longer ones because this is like as long as you're going to get. The problem with that is this is via Evan Abrams, our director of research. The eventual NBA champion has been listed below 20-1 entering the season in 9 straight years, 12 of the past 13, and 38 of the past 40. So, like, the super long teams are not the ones that win it. That doesn't mean that we haven't had, really good value 12-1 and more. But I do think that that's kind of part of the struggle here. And like Joe, you're one of the best at our company at opportunistic betting. Like you are always a person that like you are so good at recognizing when a market emerges as valuable. I think you're both really good at that. That's why I have you on the futures episodes. But to me, like that's one of the challenges I think of the off season is one, you're just going to like, as Jim mentioned, you're just sitting there with your money tied up for the whole year. And even the regular season futures are 6 months. The title odds are 9. Like it's basically 9 months that you're going to be tied up. And that's if you wait till October. If you do it now, you're literally talking about a year. Like it's 11 months that you would be having this money tied up. And a lot of people, I understandably don't want to do that. On the other end of it though, I think that we find a lot of good value in futures and it's one of our favorite things to talk about. It's some of the most fun stuff to bet and you can find some really good positions. So I guess I'll ask you, when you look at NBA futures in preseason, you're a guy that's always looking for good payout on those types of things. How do you approach this kind of dilemma where the favorites, we usually like limit down who can win the NBA title to 4 or 5, maybe 6 teams at most. Sometimes it's 3 teams. How do you balance that out with trying to find value in the offseason?
So I think the best way to do it is really to look at what the market is giving you and say like, okay, if I think all these things are going to happen, which numbers are just going to be gone? Like they're just never going to exist again. And I think that that's really the best way to try to look at it, right? Because even let's use this year for an example. Philadelphia was 16-1. I think it was low as 16-1. There might've been an 18-1 at one point for them to win the title. They're now like 7.5-1, 8-1. They were the 16.5 or 16-18-1 pre-free agency. And you knew they had a ton of cap room. They could sign literally anybody to max contracts, and not even just one player, like multiple players or other like key players or rotational pieces. They were a team that if you looked at it and you said like, okay, I believe in what they have in Tyrese Maxey, Joel Embiid. I think that they're going to be able to go get a free agent. As soon as they signed Paul George, those odds tanked and they went down to like basically in half. They cut in 50%. So I think that's like an opportunity where you could say like, all right, if I like this team and I think that they can go and add that piece, because Paul George is somebody that was linked to the Philadelphia 76ers for a long time. So if you looked at it and you said, okay, if they bring in Paul George, and I think they have a good chance, I think it's worth betting now because I'm never going to see a 16-1 on this team again, as long as they have those like 2 pieces plus a third being Paul George. So that's one way to do it. Another way is like, I think that with the rise, obviously, in the legalization of sports betting, you have this proliferation of free bets and free bet credits and things like that. So if you don't want to tie it up like cash, right? Like I know a lot of people like to do some of the promos that are associated with other sports, whether it's the W, whether it's Major League Baseball, whether it's like the summer games, whatever it is, right? You get a lot of free bets. And I think that that's a good way that you can start like rolling things in when you're like, I don't know if this number is going to exist, or maybe, maybe he's going to play really well in summer league. Maybe he's going to do this. Maybe he's going to do that. And, maybe this team doesn't do anything in the off season. So this is a great opportunity for me to say like, all right, like Josh Giddey, for example, new team, we're looking at this, we're saying, is Chicago going to move Levine? If they do move Levine, maybe that opens up even more minutes for a guy like Josh Giddey to enter like the most improved market, right? He's like 30 to 40 to 1. So there's certain players and certain opportunities in the summer that I think don't necessarily present themselves like in the regular season, because there are so many questions. But like if you kind of read the tea leaves, you look at the way the salary cap structured, you look at the way these teams are moving, you read some of the rumors, you're going to miss on a couple, but at the same time, if you get really good value in the summer, I think it really sets you up to be in position to bet on like to bet heavier on some of the positions that you like as they solidify more come, the regular season.
So a lot of what Joe's talking about is CLV, right? Like that closing line value where we have value at one point and then we have it later on. Jim mentioned the title market. This to me is like a very good example of this, where one of the things that I noticed, there's a really great website, Sports Odds History, is going to get you a history of not only can you mess around there and find historical data, because that's what it sounds like, right? Like Sports Odds History. The better thing, though, is like it gives you season by season in the season what the value was on their various prices. And this one I think is like a really good explanation of this. The Boston Celtics last summer on June 12th were plus 550. After they trade for Drew Holiday and the season is getting ready to begin, they move all the way down to plus 4. They're on November 1st, they're plus 400. So that's like 2 weeks, or on the opening night, they're plus 400. Before the first round of the playoffs, they're plus 160. Now that's a significant amount of movement, right? That's plus 160 from 4 to 1. It's 1.6 to 4 to 1 is the move there. But the difference there is you will have spent that, like if you had not bet them at 4 to 1 and had bet them at 1 to 6, you would have gotten a full 6 months of data of them being the best team in the league, of them beating absolutely everybody, of them being best by margin, and still winding up being 1.6 to 1. The Dallas Mavericks were, on the other hand, they were 12 to 1 on June 12th when they have the market opening on June 12th. Before round 1 of the playoffs, they were longer at 16 to 1. Now, there were longer points during the season when you could have bet the Mavericks, and some of our folks did bet the Mavericks. But it kind of goes to show you that before round 1 of the playoffs, you can still get very good numbers on conference and title futures. And I think it's going to be a change for me, Jim, in terms of I still think I'll bet some of the exactas, because I'll talk about this in a little bit. I did like that strategy when we build into the talk that you had about matchups being uncertain and those types of things. To me, exactas are a good way to go about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I did want to ask you, based off of Joe's point, when we look at this closing line value, do you assess any, because you can't just assess a bet being good or not based off of whether it wins or not. That's just not a good way to evaluate it. But for you, if a bet has good closing line value, if the number closes at the last moment that it's available as a worse number than when you got it, do you consider that to be a successful bet?
Well, I think that's like part of what triggered this whole thought in my head, is because we had, and it was Brandon, I believe, gave out, I think it was an episode with Brandon and Joe. So Joe, sorry if it was actually one of you two, gave out the Thunder to win the Western Conference last year during the summer. And we grabbed it. I think to win the Western Conference was 65 to 1. And I had that ticket all year, and it was amazing, amazing ticket. And I never really leveraged it. Now, part of it was I'm a little bit of like in the Brandon camp of not wanting to hedge out. And I was like, look, I was low on the Mavericks all year. That was not fun. And I looked at that matchup and I said, I think the Thunder are going to win this matchup. So I don't really want to hedge it with a ticket that I don't believe all that much. And I could have done a Dallas thing, but even then this was like the conference semis and there was still some work to go beyond that. So I had an awesome ticket and I struggled to leverage it well. Now part of that is on me. I could have been less stubborn and hedged into it. But I also would have been really annoyed if the Thunder had won and I had eaten into what, my potential wings just because I went against what I had believed. So I am struggling a little bit with the leveraging of these long shots, but I think Joe does make the point of the number that's going to be gone. Maybe this isn't as relevant for title where you pointed out that 38 of 40 are 20 to 1 or lower, but there's definitely stuff out there to go in. And I think like awards markets, because like Joe was talking about the Sixers. The Sixers are probably the best ticket to have gotten right after the finals, right? Because the main piece of free agency landed in Philadelphia, and the odds shifted the most in terms of a number that now lands in that real contender tier. But you can do this in other markets too, and I think what like an interesting idea for this is CJ McCollum in New Orleans. What if someone if Ingram goes out of town, someone comes back, McCollum gets bumped into like a sixth man role, something like that. So thinking like pieces ahead in other markets where there are long shots more available, I do think is still the way to go. You can even, Trey Murphy, is he going to move into a starting lineup if Ingram goes? Is that going to be good for a most improved player? If Ingram stays, is he going to be a good sixth man of the year candidate? Just kind of thinking of that kind of like what's one step beyond the thing that might happen. And Ingram's the most likely piece, of a big piece right now. Ingram's probably not going to shift the title odds in and of himself. So I might look to a different market like awards or division, things like that. That because the title to me is just so tricky to leverage. And I do think exactas, to your point, are an interesting way to do it because we are in this, the matchup era where if we think, the East is still going to belong to the Celtics, but X, Y, and Z teams, I would like to beat the Celtics, but I would like the Celtics to beat A, B, and C. You could sprinkle a little bit of those, leverage yourself really well on Boston, and cover yourself a little bit in terms of the exact matchup because I think the Bucket Screw as a whole had a really good job kind of looking at matchups this playoffs and saying, reading those matchups really well. So I think that is something that we have a feel for, which is why I want to leverage it when the time comes, when I see the bracket, and I'm more hesitant to do it right now when we're flying blind. It seems like it's kneecapping us, one of our biggest strengths.
Yeah, I think just to respond to that a little bit, Jim, I think that the part of what you're talking about like wanting to like not hedge like certain tickets, right? I think that like maybe that's where the framework or like the thought process can get kind of skewed because I think like you almost have to consider your futures portfolio as like one thing and then your active betting like on a nightly basis or like on a round basis like as a different thing. So it's like just because I have a ticket, like I had the Minnesota Timberwolves, just because I had a ticket on the Minnesota Timberwolves didn't mean that I wasn't going to bet them in those individual rounds either. Because like if I liked the matchup, I still wanted to be able to maximize and optimize the fact that like I have a good read on this team. I want to bet them now. So I think that maybe that's where it gets to be a little bit fuzzy because people are like so concerned with locking in a profit or being able to say like I had this really good ticket and I didn't let it go to waste because I hedged and I bought like this other piece, right? So like I know I left with something. But at the same time, it's like if you really like an individual matchup as opposed to like saying it's almost like to me, I'm like, is it worth it? Like, am I ever going to be able to hedge it enough where it's worth it? Because like, if I have a ticket that's going to pay 65 to 1, in order for me to hedge, I have to hedge like a lot, right? Like you have to hedge so significantly. Then if you were right, are you going to hedge again? Because like, depending on the round that you're in, it's like you end up having to hedge so much that you're going to basically make your ticket go into smoke. And like, right. I think the way you almost have to look at it is say like, all right, my futures are here. If they hit, awesome. Or maybe if I get to like the very end, then that's where I can say like, all right, I can bet against it or I can try to lock something in. But if you start doing it too early, you're just going to give up all your profit.
I think some of this is just, you have to have certain things that if X happens, I'm just going to lose.
Yeah.
I think you can work around those parameters. Cause like, honestly, like this happened to me in 2023 where like, I know a lot of our crew got in on the Heat. I did not. And so, like, for me, it was really shit. Like, now I had like Nuggets to win the title positions, so I was okay. But even then, like, a lot of my Nuggets, like, I was heavy on Celtics because I was like, yeah, I think they're gonna do this. And then what winds up happening is like the Heat get there and all those exactas are gone, right? But yeah. at no point was I like, did I want to bet on Miami on a long-term basis because they weren't good. And so like you do have to kind of decide. Now, two of the best bets that, and this crew specifically came up with this last year, where like we talked about, we're doing long shots and Joe gave out the Wolves. And this is like the exact kind of situation where he talks about where, are you going to hedge with the Mavericks? Because then even if you hedge with the Mavericks, you've eaten out of your profit for them to win the title. And then they're facing Boston when they're going to be an underdog again. And so you're having to pay into it again. And so like, there does have to be, I do think there's a way to do this where if you're going to build a portfolio, you cannot be like, I'm building a portfolio of every single Eastern Conference contender. Like you have to choose like, no, I do not think this team is winning the title.
Yeah.
Right. Like I never bet a Cavs future. I never bet, I'm trying to think what the other teams were.
Miami.
Really?
I never bet the Bucks. That's actually the best one.
Yeah.
Is that the Bucks I didn't have a single ticket on because I was like, no, I'm out on them. And if the Bucks had won the title, I would have just lost. Right.
Yeah.
I think Fiddle had Pacers, and he's talked a lot about this, about like what a good bet the Pacers was. I will say this too, like a lot of this depends on your tolerance for pain, because if you bet at 65-1 or greater and you get this awesome position, and even if you have to pay through the nose on Boston, you can go ahead and lock in a profit, and that counts on your ROI. It's painful, I think, for a lot of folks in order to do that. Like that's one of the things that I have decided that I'm going to do is I don't think you should build a position on a team with the idea that I am open to hedging it. I'm not just riding this. If you're doing like a portfolio position, it better be something where you think that they have a legit chance. I would have never bet the Pacers, even though I was like, I like their round 1 and round 2 matchups. I didn't bet a single time on Pacers Eastern Conference. And that's like the exact type of bet that I usually am like, ooh, gimme.
Yep.
And the reason I didn't is because I was like, they're going to be such fucking dogs to the Celtics. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. There's going to be nothing I can effectively do with it. So I think you have to look at it as whatever your pain threshold is, whether it's 4-1, 3-1, 2-1, you need to set that for expecting what that price is going to be for you to have to hedge.
So then at that point, do we really just need to cut it down to conference winners though? Because the title winners have come from such a narrow window, is it just conference winner plays?
I think that's accurate, right? So one of the things, and I've hit this over and again, I actually don't have this number, sorry, in front of me, but basically in the last 30 years, there's only been like 3 teams that have made the final, 4 teams now that have made the finals as lower than a 3 seed.
Yeah.
And none of them have won the title. Like 96 Rockets or 95 Rockets, I think, is the last time a team actually won the title with one that low. And so they might make it, but they don't win it. And what we've seen we've seen this in back-to-back years. We've seen an 8 seed and a 5 seed now make the finals. And that speaks to Jim's point of matchups and the level of parity that we have in the league right now, which is why, Jim, I like those finals exact matchups or the exact over bets, is because I stumbled upon this talking to you guys where I was like, okay, we never really get those matchups that we think we're going to get unless it is Steph Curry's Warriors versus LeBron James's Cavaliers. That was a specific moment in time where those two teams were so dominant and those two players were so dominant. There wasn't anybody else that could get in, like if they played in the same conference, it would have been different. We had to have that exact setup where it was Steph's Warriors, LeBron's Cavs in the East. And that specific setup allowed for it. Outside of that, we don't get the expected matchups that we think we're going to get, which is why I started really betting like, I'm going to bet Nuggets, Knicks, Nuggets, Sixers. Now, then I got stuck with the Sixers being in the fucking 3-6? Is that no 2-7 in the 2-7, and that was unfortunate for many reasons. But on the other side, I also had I had Boston, Minnesota. I had Boston, Oklahoma City. I didn't bet Boston, Denver, so I was able to bet the other way on this, and I did bet Boston, Dallas, because so many of our like, even when I was skeptical of it and I was making fun of Watts for it being trendy, I was like, these guys know what they're doing, so I bet Boston, Dallas, and I made a mint on it. Like, it was really good. So Jim, that's kind of my point here. I think is, and to Joe's point, if you have these type of possessions, I think instead of like safe bets the other way, you try and find opportunities to aggressively bet having already established those positions where you're at getting a big number and then hedging it with another big number. That to me seems like maybe a better long-term approach, as long as you're not committing too much of your bankroll towards it.
Now, can I now say the opposite? So if I were listening to this and I didn't agree with, I think what we're saying, I think the natural pushback would be to say it does seem like if we are emphasizing that this is a league of parity right now, and
Yep.
we saw, and you said that the two most recent seasons are two kind of anomalies
Yep.
that we got lower seeds from the conferences. Couldn't things align very easily, and suddenly we do have the two long shots facing off, and then we do get a long shot title winner. So I think that, like, especially when we use the stat like 38 of the last 40, the league definitely is different than it was in the 80s and 90s. I do think it's, and even you can argue, like you said, even 5-6 years ago when we were getting the LeBron Steph matchups, I do think we are in a little bit of a different era, which then draws me back into these long shots. But that's what I'm pushing back and forth in my head of like, it feels like it should be valuable, but I'm not seeing the value play out. But is that just small sample?
Well, I think it's actually okay to bet on, because like the Thunder were a long shot this time last year. You just listed the price on it, right?
Yeah.
Like the key is to be able to find those teams, and like, to be honest, like Minnesota is another good example of this, where I was all in on Minnesota. It was like, yeah, love them for the division, love them for the over, love them for all these things. And then Joe's like, for them to win the title, and I was like, are you crazy? And like, that's something I've learned from the both of you, which is like, don't, and Brandon too, to his credit, is like, honestly, no half measures.
But you
Like,
were like both right. You were both right because they didn't win it.
Okay, so I'll say this: they didn't win it. And this is kind of to your point, how unstable this thing is. Here's what's really funny, because this gets back to the matchup thing. I think the Wolves beat the Thunder.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Like, I think Thunder were really good, and I think
Yeah.
that would have been a really good series. It would have been better than what we got. But the difference now is like, the idea now is like, well, Dallas was just so much better. I'm like, no, like, I'm sorry, like Dallas was not a great team. Good, I will give them. Okay, sure, you made the finals. It sounds stupid if I'm like, you weren't good, but not no.
Yeah.
And like, there's a lot of these scenarios where I don't think that, even in the Thunder series, I understand like how they won that series. And so even though like that Minnesota, like, yeah, they lost, and you're like, that's the proof of the matchup problem, I do think that there's still something to be said for the value, because there are ways you could have effectively hedged the Thunder, and there definitely were ways to bet the Wolves. But I am with you that I used to be like, I don't want conference until I see the matchups. I do want title. And I've kind of like rethought that, where I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. I need to bet the teams that I think are best insulated against certain matchups, or have the most opportunity in those matchups. That's the other way to look at it.
Yeah.
Right? You either need to be a safe team that you think can overcome matchup disadvantage, or you need to go the other way and have it be like, they give a lot of these teams specifically trouble. And that's like a different way to kind of approach it.
So Matt, what I'm hearing is the Rockets are 125-1 to win it all right now.
They did win the season series versus the Denver Nuggets, who were considered one of the favorites in the West.
That's good.
So Joe, I want to kind of ask you on this, like, how do you track your portfolio? Like, what do you do in order, if you're with the positions that you take? Because to me, you don't seem like the same kind of psycho that I am, where I'm like, oh God, I better get a position on this team, which is not good, by the way. But you're much more opportunistic, where you're like, no, I really like this value at this moment in time. And like, futures is a good way to look, is a good term for it, where it's like, we'll see where this looks like in a couple of weeks. How do you go about betting, allocating resources out of your bankroll, and tracking those kind of portfolio plays?
Yeah. So I think for like the average bettor anyway, like what I kind of mentioned about free bets is like a really good way to supplement a portfolio. I think that the way that you kind of need to look at your futures portfolio is like, you try to get good positions when you can, like you try to get good value, and like try to optimize the value that you have. But then I think that you also have to understand, I think it's better for like awards markets, right? Like last year with Wemby, we had talked on so many podcasts. We were like, is it Chet? Is it Wemby? Is it Chet? Or is it Wemby? And I think I said every time, I was like, it's Wemby. He's going to win. It's Wemby. Like, I don't want to hear it. Like, we're just going to wait and we're going to bet it. And like, we did kind of bet a couple times. Like, we were saying like, all right, well, like Chet's the underdog right now. You should bet Chet. He's plus money. Then Wemby got to be plus money. And we were like, and I was like, hammer Wemby. And then like, then like, that's kind of the way you can do it. But I think you have to be able to say like, you have to like be immune to some of like recency bias, right? So like if something happens in the league and you're like, man, like he had an awesome game, like you have to be able to differentiate saying like, is this a flash in the pan or is this legit? And a lot of times like we'll see like somebody play like an incredible game, but it's like, okay, but it was an ideal matchup. Somebody was out for that game due to rest reasons or this or that. It's like, this is like unlikely to replicate. Whereas in other instances where if you look at say the injury report and you said, okay, well, somebody's going to be out. Like, let's say, I'm trying to think of like a situation. Okay. Like this year, like with the Knicks, right? Like Julius Randle's going to be out for the rest of the regular season. And what does that do for a guy like Jalen Brunson? And Jalen Brunson shot up the MVP odds. He didn't win, but his odds shortened significantly. So I'm not saying that like, you don't always need to bet something, because it's like, that was a spot where we're saying like, all right, well, like it would be awesome. Like as a Knicks fan, it'd be awesome if you won. But at the same time, like you could recognize the opportunity there and say like, okay, well, the offshoot of Randle being out, maybe it impacts the Knicks ceiling, but it also is going to open up a window for maybe a guy to get in contention for an award. Maybe we can buy a position here that we didn't have, or maybe somebody slots up and then has to play like a lot more minutes, whether it was like Josh Hart played a ton of minutes and then he started getting some traction for like 6th man of the year, stuff like that. So I think that this is a long-winded version of me saying, you need to be able to kind of assess what the news is and say like, all right, you don't want to allocate too much of your bankroll to futures, but and I think that you can allocate more later in the season because you're getting that return a little bit sooner. Like if you're allocating 25% of your bankroll to futures in the summer, kind of like you said, Matt, your ROI it changes a little bit because of the time value of money, obviously. So if you lay $100 today, it's not the same as laying $100 in like 7 months, because you're getting it back. You're able to use it for 7 months, and you're able to kind of assess and use your money a little bit more often, or so to speak, rather than locking it away for so long on a bet that maybe you could make a little bit later.
Yeah, and I'll be honest. I had everything tracked in a spreadsheet. What I didn't do as much as I needed to was I didn't add everything to the app. Honestly, it was like a cost for me.
Yeah,
There's a going joke in
it
Action
happens.
Network Slack that the minute that you don't log a
Yeah.
bet in the app, it's automatically going to hit.
Lock.
It's just
Lock. It's a lock.
smash it.
It's a lock.
Jim, when you're looking at kind of like your positions, what's your approach to managing your bankroll, and what's kind of your approach to tracking these things throughout the year so that you're not over leveraged in too many ways?
Yeah, I do think that I approach it kind of in between the two of you, where I think certainly during the off season and even during, I would say, the first 3 quarters of the season, I really am just going for, if there is something that I think will move, I want to get it in the portfolio. Anyone who follows me in the app, I've got like 100 MLB futures open right now. I'm not shy with the futures, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I'll lock those up. But with NBA, I do think this is kind of the combination of everything we talk of, is that then when it comes around to it, the end of the year, I very much am paying attention to the positions I have built up, and I am looking, and like Joe said, I do think that the toughest part is assessing whether you want to treat your futures as one separate entity or if you want to kind of include them in everything. And I think I often am of the mind, I think holistically, and I'm like, I don't want to buy out of this Thunder ticket because I still like them. And it's like, if I thought of it, all as one, I guess it's the opposite of vice. I don't think of it all as one. I think of it very much as like, this is my futures piece, and I don't want to buy out of the Thunder because I still like the Thunder and I don't want to shred this ticket. So I struggle with that. And I think that's something that I'm still working through, is like, where are the times you can leverage the good portfolio that you built up? But I really do end up being, more often than not, if the read was good, often it's going to be good later on. Now, what I will say is I do think that there is a potential, like that Wolves ticket, loved the Wolves ticket, but then I thought that Dallas was a bad matchup for them. So that one I didn't mind buying out of and getting on the Dallas side of things. So the tickets can help you. They're not going to hurt. If you get a good ticket, like I kind of said earlier, of like, the Wolves ticket didn't hit, it wasn't good. That's not entirely true, for sure. And you push back on that correctly, because it did hold value because the matchup broke in our favor this time. So I don't think there's a perfect answer, I guess. I'm kind of rambling here. I think that it kind of depends on, I think you have to really be attuned to things and have a good big picture perspective, and then just kind of trust your ability to cap the game. I don't think there's like a really easy answer, unfortunately.
MVP is my favorite thing to bet. It's my favorite award to bet. I spent a ton of time on it. I've always spent a lot of time on it in my career. People are like, what's with the MVP thing? And the answer I give is I was at CBS, and when you do as much content as we did at CBS, writing daily, and you're writing about all these different angles, I was like, you have to decide with certain things. You either have to be like, I'm going to care a lot about this, or I'm not going to care about it at all because I don't have the bandwidth.
Yep.
And for MVP, I decided I was like, I want to care about this. Like, this is a very big story of the league. And then like the betting side has provided like a whole other way to kind of look at it. What's been frustrating, honestly, it's not his fault. It's just a reality. Part of the problem with the MVP markets is just Embiid. Like, it's just like a huge problem when one of the best players in the league who racks up incredible numbers, would have led the league in scoring in back-to-back seasons, is a major injury risk. Like, it's just like a huge, because last year I was like, Embiid's going to walk to this. Like, this is the best season I've seen him have. Like, he was awesome on defense. Like, I was giving him shit about the matchups that he was ducking because he wasn't playing in certain games. He was still going to roll to it, which is why I kept betting him. And then he's out. And then like the whole thing kind of goes sideways. But we kind of talked about this, like, how should you hedge? There are certain sports books that allow you to actually hedge or actually parlay awards. And you can say, like, I understand how dangerous parlays are. Like, I'm fully aware of it. And like Fiddle would be screaming his head off right now about it.
No, keep going.
Awards to me are a little bit different. That's the thing, is like awards to me are a little bit different, where if I know Wembanyama's going to win and it's still early enough in the season that he's minus 230, and I know this other guy's going to win this award and he's minus 150 or whatever, and then I can go ahead and get a position on Nikola using that as my hedge to boost those numbers to get it a little bit more palatable. Like, that's how I was able to hedge a little bit off of Shea. But at the same time, like, I didn't hedge completely off of Shea because I thought, like, I was like, that was one where I was like willing to lose. I was like, Shea Gilgeous-Alexander is going to wind up on the number 1 seed. He did. With some of the best advanced metrics in the league. He did. And all these types of things. Now, I made the argument for Jokic to win MVP. I think he's totally deserving of winning. But I was also just like, okay with that. Was one where I just kept coming around to it. I kept betting Shea. And I was like, if I'm wrong, then I'm okay with it. And I was wrong because Nikola was able to have like a good enough stretch and people were not ready to like acknowledge Shea yet. I think honestly now it's a lot different because he did have those playoff games and he made the second round and people have seen him now and they know how to spell his name. That helps. So like, those kind of things I think are important. I do think you have to be willing to lose some of these positions, Jim, but I think that the awards, I think you do have a really good idea. If you could just get in the top 3 for most of the awards, you can usually do something interesting by the end of the season to be able to provide yourself with not only like a break even, but actually profit.
Yeah, I think you really came down on a good side of it there with like you really do have to be able to lose these bets. And I think that's a lot easier said than done. I think this is almost like, you said earlier, 500,000 foot, like this is like 2 trillion foot lens on just betting as a whole. But it comes back to why you should always be betting an amount that you're not like chasing and you feel comfortable if it disappears from your bank, because any of these bets, if you lose it, you have to be like, oh, all right, that was like the cost of a sandwich or a dinner. And like, it's not, I'm not chasing to be like, holy crap, I have to get something out of this bet that I bet. So like, to me, that's like an even bigger just betting picture, perspective on it. I think you're 100% right. You really, when you're doing futures and when you're doing long shots, especially like, Joe and I would say of all the people I've met, maybe Brandon up there too, love betting long shots more than anyone else. It means you can go like, your record can be like, 4-40 and you're making money if it's long enough shots. You really have to be able to just eat L after L. And even the ones that kind of chew you up, like me with this Thunder ticket that I keep referencing of like, how did I not leverage it? It's going to happen sometimes. It was, a solid bet. It ended the season and the Thunder were clearly better than 65-1 to come out of the West. It lost. It was a solid bet. And if you make enough of those, you'll be in a position where you're comfortable to let some slide, even if some kind of gnaw at you a little bit. You just have to be able to let it go.
Yeah, and I think I kind of learned this lesson specifically a couple years ago. So I'm not like the biggest baseball bettor, but a few years ago I had the Nationals to win the World Series at 100-1, and it was the year that they won the World Series. But I hedged so much, like when they played the Dodgers in the playoffs, that I wound up cutting into what I was going to win so much, and then they were massive underdogs to the Astros, and then I was like, now what do I do now, right? So I kind of learned that lesson from that, because I was like, at the time it was, it was like whatever it was 5-6 years ago, and it was like a $50 ticket to win 5 grand, which is, it's a pretty significant sum of money. And I was so focused on, like, I was like, well, I don't want to lose the chance to win like the 5 grand, but really, like, I was looking at it the wrong way, because I was like, every time I kept hedging into it, I was losing the chance to win the 5 grand. Like, I could never win it, right? Because I kept buying at it, like basically buying against it. So a couple years ago, or I guess it was last year or 2 seasons ago, when Jaren Jackson Jr. won Defensive Player of the Year and we had him at 60-1, I was like, I love this ticket. I don't need to bet against it. Like, I'm comfortable losing because I got such a good number. Like, I want to win on this number. If I lose, I lose. It's 1 unit. But like, I don't want to then cut into like a 30 unit. Like, if I cut it in half, then it's like I change it to a 30-1. And if you do that on all of your tickets, you're going to start like really taking away a lot of your ROI, like a lot of the things that make you sharp, where it's like, I think this is so good, I got the best number. And then, like, if you hedge on the last day, it's like you're at the finish line and you're like, here's half of it back, sportsbook. Like that's what I think it is. So it is like, it's tough. You have to be like a little bit of a masochist, I think, in order to do this. But I think that's also why I think it's important. I think it's good to have them tracked separately. The Action app lets you track them separately. You have your regular stuff, you have your futures in particular, like chart that you can look at. And I think it helps you understand that's like, yeah, like I think my futures portfolio in the Action app, I've hit like 20% of my bets, but my ROI is ridiculous. So, and that's the thing that matters at the end of the day. So it's a palette for risk, but also, like you said, it's like, be comfortable with what you're betting. Like, don't bet numbers or amounts that if you lose, you're like, oh my God, this is a disaster.
There's a lot of ways. So a lot of good stuff there. I think one of the elements there that's really good is you're like, I want to win with this number, and I fall into the other trap of like, I just don't want to lose. I just don't want to lose. Like, I just want to, just come out ahead. And what I wind up doing there oftentimes is like, I'll take 2 of the possible 3 options, and the third one hits, and then you've lost twice. And part of that is that like, this is honestly one of the great things about Brandon. So like, Brandon's really, he's thoughtful, and he's a very deep thinker, and he's got a good understanding of math, and he's got great instincts. But the other thing is, like, he has conviction, where like Brandon is like this. And I'm good on content, because literally if somebody was like, we want you and Jim to have a conversation about the Celtics and the Sixers and their chances to win the Eastern Conference, and Jim was like, well, I think it's the Celtics, and it was like, you need to take the Sixers, I could construct an argument that sounded very convincing, that I was absolutely believer in the Philadelphia 76ers. But the reality is, like, I've been covering this league so long, I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know. Like, sometimes the shots don't go in. Sometimes like weird shit happens. Sometimes guys get hurt. Sometimes there's chemistry problems. Like, I've just seen a bunch of shit at this point where I don't have that kind of conviction, and that's what leads me to over committing to too many positions in the portfolio. So that's something like I'm trying to improve, is like trying to be like, okay, what are these certain types of teams? And we'll do this when Brandon and I go through our annual kind of list of how we approach things. Like, for the awards, there are historical markers of, hey, if you're this old, you don't win. If you're not this, you don't win. If you haven't been this, you don't win. And those have held up pretty consistently. And so that will narrow it down, and then you can kind of do process of elimination. Like, I'm actually already starting to think, based off of that number I got from Evan, like, okay, we haven't seen these 20-1s, and Jim's right that it goes back to the 80s, and that doesn't matter. By the way, like, you're right. But 12 of 13 is still pretty recent.
For sure.
Right? And so it's like, all right, how many teams are under 20-1? And at BetMGM, king of sportsbooks, it's Bucks, Wolves, Mavericks, Knicks, Nuggets, Sixers, Thunder, Celtics. So like, you should be able to go through. Like, I think I'm going to do this later. I'm going to go through that and be like, nope, I don't think them. Nope, I don't think them. Nope, I don't think them. And then basically be able to
here's my three.
Yeah. And look at that. Now, the problem with that gets back to the thing that we started with, which is I'm probably going to come out with like, hey, I think the Boston Celtics can win the title. Really? Is that what you think at plus 310? That's your thought process after they won the NBA title, right? When you could still probably get them at plus 160 before the NBA playoffs start, or better if they have bad luck and they don't finish with the 1 seed. So there are all these kind of things.
Can I circle back to one thing you said? Just because listening to you talk through of the like, I just don't want to lose it. I think that is where the vast majority of people are. So I don't want to like be up here on like a soapbox and be like, listen, just let your long tickets ride. Like we all saw during the postseason, there was that guy who had, I think it was like 3 title winners all combined. And he cashed it out, and a lot of people like came down on him. And I kind of came down on the side of like, that was like life-changing money. Like that, he was very fair to cash that out. And I think that has to be a reality too. I was up here saying, you know, like don't bet amounts that you can't, that you don't mind if they don't win. But at the same time, I have to realize if someone has a ticket that the money is going to like change if they can leverage it out, or if it's even just like $100 is going to be really nice. Listen, you got to do what you got to do at the end of the day. So I don't want to ever come across as like some like, you know, robot math person that's just like, you have to do X, Y, Z. Like I understand everyone's circumstances are different, but I think in my personal position, if you are able to bet things and you can truly just, it disappears from your account and you don't mind, I think it's often better to let things ride.
Look, I think so much of this is like some of the best minds, I think, in sports betting content, they're professional bettors. Yeah. That's their job, and they do content on the side. And so from them, like shaving off 50% of an ROI ticket, if it were to hit, like that's a not devastating, but that's a really bad downturn. It's like if a company was like, yeah, no, we made money, but we made half as much as we could have made selling this product.
Yeah.
Right. Like that would just be bad business. And so for them, it's like a long-term thing versus if you're a recreational bettor, it's just like a lot different. And I think that that's like part of the equation here. Like I love talking betting. I love talking about the process of betting. I love talking about betting more than I love betting. And that's like part of the equation here. I think it's been really good. One final thing I want to get into was just win totals, which is Joe, I want your thoughts on this because you find very good ways to get plus numbers. And like I like that we have got, like I've tried to build buckets that way where Fiddle's a guy that's like, yep, bet minus 500. It's a great bet. I will fight you about how great my minus 10,000 bet is. And then we have like Brandon, who's like, the only good bet is like 80 to 1. Although he did take some, he got in on the buying the juice with the Celtics this year. With preseason bets, I think betting win totals are fun, but it is minus 110 to lock up your money for 9 months, right? Yeah. 6 to 9 months. What's your approach there in terms of what you're looking for with these preseason bets? And I think very specifically with both of you, I'd like to hear like if there's a number where you really start to be like, oh, now that's interesting because 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, 15, 20, like where do you start to really get interested in adding a number to your portfolio?
I think the way that I try to look at win totals is like, I want to feel really strongly about the total to a point that I would bet an alternate line. So like if I like a line like last year, for example, it didn't totally work out, but like I liked Miami's under, I liked them to be in the play-in. I liked them to miss the playoffs. I wanted like every single bet in that market. Right. For me, it was like, I was so confident in the under whatever it was like 45.5 or 46.5 that I was so confident in that. I was like, I'm going to use this now to fund the other bets basically. Because they were at like plus numbers. So I try to look at it that way. It's literally like a ladder, but for a future. And I think that that's one way to do it. I think that also like when I'm looking at win totals, there's only so much that they can kind of go up, right? It's like, all right, like, and it winds up getting to be almost like parabolic, I guess, in terms of, I'm trying to think of the right expression. It's kind of like parabolic in terms of like how much better they have to get, right? Like when you're looking at raw win totals, especially for these good teams where it's like, let's look at Philly, for example, right? They're already at some books at 53.5 wins. That's their market. Like For them to get to 60 is a monster jump because there's only 82 games, right? So it's like you have to be so much better to get there. Whereas for Philly, I think that rather than bet like an alt win total, if you wanted to bet an over, you'd be better off looking at like 1 seed. You'd be better at looking at win the division, because if they got to 60 wins, you'd say like, well, they probably can beat the Celtics then, or they probably come out on top of the Celtics. They probably come out on top of the Knicks. So I think that that's a way to do it there. For the bad teams, or so to speak, like the teams that are more like you're hoping maybe they make the play in. So like a team, say like the Spurs, right? For me, I think that their number, it's about 34.5 for win total. It's something I was looking at, but I don't know which direction the season's going to go in for them. So for me, like I don't want to bet the 34.5 because I think 34.5 leaves them out of the playoff picture, especially in the West. And if they come short of that, like if they get close, but then they're like, like we're not going to get there, let's just tank at the end of the season. And then your win total's blown. For me, like a team like the Spurs, I would rather look at it and say like, all right, I want to bet them to be in the play-in. I want to bet them to maybe win 45 games. I want to bet on them to make the playoffs and look at those alternates instead, because like I think that is like the better way to get their like distribution on the bell curve, or so to speak, if I want to bet on their ceiling, as opposed to the 34.5 kind of being like a median outcome that I don't even know if it's really like the median outcome, or so to speak.
Yeah, and see, let's take the Pistons example from our win totals conversation. Like I've been thinking a lot about Jim's wanting them for the play-in tournament, and about like what I think, because I was like, whoa, let's hold on there. But I was kind of thinking about this where, if I have them projected at 28, so I'm taking a very metric approach to this, where I have projections for each team.
Yep.
And I'm trying to build positions based off of basically the biggest delta between them. Like if I have a team that's less than a win difference, I'm not even going to bother looking at that, unless I have like a really good angle that I like. And we'll talk about those as we get closer to the season. But with some of these teams, and I think the Wolves are a good example of this, the Thunder were a good example of this, where like I bet Thunder over win total early in the season. By the way, we should have talked about that on win totals. You can still bet win totals in season and get great numbers, because the books were slow on both OKC and Indiana. They were like, they can't get off their power rating quickly enough. And so like that first month of the season, when you're like, oh, these teams are really good, could have gotten really good numbers on those that were only slightly higher. And with OKC, I got on division odds too, and that built a really good position on me for division. Because again, I just kept like that. That's like the opposite of what happened with the playoffs, where it's like you bet two and then the other one wins. Is I made a strong position. I was like, it's going to be OKC or Minnesota. It's not going to be Denver. Like I just kept betting that way, and it worked out. But with Jim, we talked about the Pistons. If we're right and the Pistons are better, there's probably an exponential effect where, like maybe my initial projection was right, but then I would have bumped them up higher because Cade Cunningham makes another leap. Jaden Ivey makes a leap. The coaching has that much of an impact. So that adds another point total, or another point to 2 points to their power rating. And now the Pistons are at like 34 to 38 wins. And that's like at the cusp of maybe being in the play-in tournament. Like is some of this basically just like the idea of it's better to be right big or wrong big than right small, wrong small, which is kind of similar to what Joe's saying.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And it's funny because it's something I'm working through with WNBA capping right now as well, because in part, and this is going to sound like a long walk to agree with you guys, but if you are, and I notice it in WNBA because there's so many limits, right? And it's really hard. It's annoying. There's really, really intense limits. So it's like, all right, if I walk this over to the side and I'm now looking at a plus 400 number, if I can get down, it's going to pay out 4 times. If I am right more often than I'm wrong, it's paying off to be on the, more extreme side. If that's a way to either make it worth locking up your money in this example, or make it worth, going around a limit here. I do think there are times where it is beneficial to go towards the side of, if I'm right, I'm really right. If I'm wrong, I'm really wrong. I think Joe used a perfect example with the Spurs of being like a team that is going to have various like wide varied outcomes. But I think even if you take a team with a normal spread, if you're doing it either to make it worth locking up your money for so long, or if you're doing it to get around limits and stuff, I think there holds value in going to the extremes of either side. And obviously, again, you have to have the palate for missing, 3 out of 4 if they're plus 500, but if you hit 1 out of 4 at plus 500, you've profited.
Yeah, I think it goes into like not to pivot it off of futures, right? But I think that in the regular season, when at the beginning of the season in particular, I think is when our edges are kind of the biggest because there's the least amount of information, right? So like if you go into the regular season and you say like, I know that this is what's going to happen. I've been listening to the beat writers. I've been watching all the plays. Like I've been watching summer league. I watch the practices. I watch preseason. Like I know, and like I listen to the coaches and I'm saying like, this is the lineup that this team is going to run, or this is what they want to do. And you can kind of get in earlier on a line because like and like really I think you need to hammer the edge like when it's there, because like with a player like Jim, you did it for the WNBA for the Commissioner's Cup, and you were like all over Bridget Carlson for her to lead the game in threes, right? You hit it like so hard they stopped offering the market because like after that, so like they had to like reassess the market. So like you can say like, oh, it's like, oh, like I want to go in like a little bit like I want to dip my toe in, and then like you might never get to again. So like if you have to trust your convictions to a degree and say like, I'm willing to be wrong because like I know if I'm right, I'm going to get paid for being right. And like I think that if they don't adjust, then great. I got everything out of all this like brain power that I spent on this. And if they don't adjust, I'm going to continue to hammer this until they finally do get to a point where the books adjust and they recognize that there is a problem or there's something that they're missing on their back end.
When we talk about like game script being useful with like same game parlays and stuff, there's season scripts too. So you could be like, I want Rockets over. I want to sprinkle Rockets division. I'm going to go for the Mavericks under. You can kind of build a season script. And if this is the time where the information is softest, it is the best time to kind of lay out a season script from a big picture. Now, again, you can get these during the season. So you definitely can do season scripting during the season of, like you said, with the Thunder, you were fading the Nuggets all year. You were on the Thunder division all year. You were kind of season scripting even in season. Yep. And it's kind of another way to go bigger and put more towards one script in particular.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. I think some of the best opportunities I bet into, like the best, you'll get the best handicapping because you've got enough time to really break this down.
Yeah.
What you think will happen. And then when you're right, not only does it pay, but you get that sweet satisfaction of the dopamine hit of being right. But
well, like Matt, can I hop in for 1 sec?
Yeah.
Because you talked about like, is it a good idea to lock up your money for 11 months on win totals? Honestly, it might not be, but they are literally my favorite thing is my singular most favorite bet. I love win totals. It's what got me into betting in the first place, and it is so fun. And the dopamine hit is great. That's why we're all here, right?
Well, see, and I really like it too. When you've got a great ticket and you're looking at all season, you're tracking it, and you're like, God, I'm a fucking genius. Look at me.
Yeah.
When I tell friends, like you can put like you could either go to a Knicks game and put $100 on the Knicks that night, or you can put $100 on them and then get 82 games worth of excitement as you watch every single night, one way or the other. That's for me holds a lot of value as well.
Yeah, my uncle does that. He's like, I'm cheap. I'm just going to bet it once, and that's it. I get to root for him every day.
bet it, set it, and forget it. Yeah, because I think, part of this, we talk about the conviction thing. Like, here's an example of a bet that Brandon lost that was really good. Brandon was like, did not believe in the Suns. He was just like, nope, I'm out. And so he bet them to miss the playoffs, and I joined him on that ticket. And they made the playoffs. That bet lost because they finished with the 6th seed, because they finished against the hardest remaining schedule. They were awesome and good for them, but they finished 3 games ahead of the 9 seed, which we kind of know now. And the 10 seed was 46 wins as well with the Warriors. Like, if you're in the 10 spot, you don't make the playoffs. Like, yep. We kind of know that going forward. That's going to influence a lot of what I'm looking at with win totals and make the playoff bets. Is like, if the teams that I think are within range of 10, if there's a plus number on them to miss the playoffs, I'm grabbing it.
Matt, it's even more painful because the bet was to be in the play-in tournament, and I watched this all year. So it actually came this close to winning, and they got so lucky by the schedule gods because they played all the easy teams when they were hurt, and then they just got hot at the end of the season. I rode that out. I didn't buy out once. It was the most painful ticket. But again, I didn't hedge out because the whole time I was like, this Suns team is not that good, but they came together at the end.
Brandon went the whole way with me. He
went full
misplay. It was full misplay.
I had both.
And like, and honestly, like, it was a really good bet. And you know that if I had Brandon on here, and I used to be like, you would just always say that your bet was right. it's because he bets with conviction and he trusts his analysis. And I think that's like a really big part of it. And honestly, something I probably need to get a little bit better at. Okay, that's going to do it for Buckets. I appreciate it. This has been a great conversation. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. No best bets today. Fun stuff. We will have best bets for you next week, as we will have a full Summer Games preview coming at you with Joe Dellera, Brian Fonseca. Make sure to check out WNBA Buckets as well. Get caught up on there. They're obviously going to be on a little bit of a break with the Summer Games coming up, but we'll have complete coverage for you on that. Check out the Action Network podcast. By the way, if you're college fans, college football is back. Big Bets on Campus came out with their 2-part big season preview, big picture. Love to hear Colin and Stuckey and Brett talking. That's awesome stuff. You can catch that as well. Go to youtube.com/The Action Network. My thanks to David Payne, our producer, as well as Hutton Jackson and the video crew getting this up at youtube.com/The Action Network. I'll see you guys again in a few weeks after a little bit of a vacation. Enjoy the Summer Games. Until next time, let's get buckets.